Welcome to the Larry Kreider's Leadership Podcast. Larry is the author of over 40 books, the founder of Dove International, a worldwide family of churches and ministries in 6 continents, and has over 50 years of leadership experience. He and his guests will share inspirational leadership insights from their journey with God. These insights, gleaned from serving leaders in many nations, will transform your life and leadership. For more information on Larry's books and resources, visit LarryKreider.com.
We are so glad you joined us today for another discussion on leadership, learning those just small things in leadership that can make a massive difference in the future. With you today is my friend Deryl Hurst. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Larry. Good to be here.
Great to have you. And obviously, you're the senior pastor of Dove Westgate Church today. Mm-hmm. You've been involved in business for years. And we just want to pull out of you some things you've learned over the years about leadership. Let's go way back. Did you, when you were growing up, did you feel like, yeah, you'll be involved in some kind of leadership? Is that ingrained in you, or tell me about that?
Yeah, it really was. I remember going back as far as first grade.
Yeah.
I had a first grade teacher who read Bible stories to us in a public elementary school.
Really?
Yeah, and of course I'm young enough, I might not look it, but I'm young enough that was illegal at the time, but she didn't care. She read Bible stories, and I always were very fascinated and very interested in Bible stories and the whole process. And so she was a very plain River Brethren woman, yeah, and she essentially prophesied over me, though. She said, "You're going to be a pastor one day."
Really?
And I believed it, and I really engaged with the idea of being in leadership in some capacity at a very young point in my life.
So that was spiritual leadership. That was church leadership. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you're serving that role for many years now.
Right.
Now, but you've spent years in what we call the marketplace, spent years in business. Mm-hmm. How did that transpire? When did you first get a feel that, you somehow could start a business or be in a business? Tell us that story.
Sure. So I out of high school, I went to work in a large corporation. And, of course, I was a very confident young man. Uh-huh. That's a polite way of saying maybe a little overconfident. And so I assumed in a very short time I would be the section leader or the plant manager or whatever. I just assumed that would be the course. And I saw quickly that setting wasn't suiting me well, and that probably wasn't going to work. And I had an uncle that was in the real estate business for many, many years. And he approached me when I was only 20 years old and said, "I believe that you would make a really good real estate agent." And the thought really appealed to me. And, of course, he put out some expectations of success that were probably not realistic.
Right.
But I bought into it.
Sure.
And so I got into the real estate business and very quickly developed an acumen for that, loved it.
So you're in your early 20s in real estate.
Mm-hmm. And so what happened then about that time, I was also the church I was attending, the denominational church I was attending at that time, it certainly appeared that I was on a course to also become a bivocational pastor in that church. Okay. And I came to realize I wasn't sure that's exactly what I wanted at that time. And about that time, I started coming to Dove Christian Fellowship, which was one church at the time, of course, in the very early 80s. And so at that point, when I began attending Dove, the thought of being a pastor seemed really far-fetched because there was this amazing man of God named Larry Kreider was a leader there. And I'm just a spiritual peon compared to this guy.
Right.
And so I this whole pastor thing was probably just a childhood fantasy, but I was really plugging into business and loving what I was doing there.
I remember you well when you were that age. I remember you could see there's a call to leadership in your life, even though I know you were involved in real estate. Now, you started a company? How did that work? Mm-hmm. How did that whole thing work?
So what happened is there was a group of us, 7 of us, in the real estate company that I was with that really felt like we wanted to do our own thing. We had a vision for some things we wanted to accomplish. So actually, I wouldn't recommend this, by the way.
Okay, here, we're talking leadership now. What did you learn about leadership?
A lot, a lot. And actually, I'll just say this before I forget it. I really feel like that of course, that childhood and youth call
Yes.
to ministry was not just a childhood fantasy. That
Right.
was a real
It was a call from
It was
God.
a real call from God. But there was such a preparatory work that had to be done first.
Right.
So those years in business were a tremendous preparation for what God had in store for me. But I needed to go through that process first.
Okay, so you had 7 people, 7 guys with a heart to start a business.
Yeah.
What would have you done different if you could have done that again?
Yeah, so we were basically seven of us started a business. There was actually 8 of us that went with the original company. One guy
Okay.
didn't want to be involved in ownership, but 7 of us. You shouldn't start a business really with 7 owners,
Right.
8 employees and 7 of them are owners.
Well, we started a church with 6 co-equal leaders, and that didn't work well either, so I get it.
Yeah, I understand. So what happened is we were recruiting and adding new agents. And along the way, there was attrition in ownership, and one person would get out, then another person.
Sure.
And ultimately, it boiled down to 3 of us that owned it for an extended period of time, and that worked a lot better than having
Sure.
7 owners.
Sure.
And during that period of time, then I learned a lot about how to manage salespeople, and it's very interesting because as it relates to the whole spiritual world,
Yes.
when you're in the real estate business, your agents are all independent contractors.
Yeah.
And so they're not technically employees. And you provide oversight and input, but they are independent contractors. And so it's not like the typical employer situation. The boss says, you do this, and you
Sure.
report at this time, and so on and so forth.
It's a volunteer army like the church,
exactly,
right?
and that's exactly the parallel.
Yeah.
Like in the church, in church leadership, you work with a lot of volunteers.
Yeah.
And so you need to encourage people to get to the place that you want your organization to go. So in real estate, it was the same way. I had to try to inspire people to get to where I knew they could be and where I wanted the company to be, and make them understand that this was a good thing and what was going to be best for them. Obviously, we do the same thing in the church. We need to inspire and
Sure.
encourage people. We can't direct and command
Can't
people.
force.
No, not at all.
So talk to us about what are some other things you learned, principles you learned during those days, those early days in business, as you have this volunteer army. Are there any other principles, things you learned, maybe the hard way?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. What I learned, one of the things that I learned in leadership is that you simply have to sometimes take ownership for things you really shouldn't have to take ownership for.
True.
I remember reading a leadership book one time, and the analogy was used of drinking the bitter water. And that's a story in the Old Testament where a woman that was accused had to drink the bitter water, and if she was guilty, it would have an ill effect on her. If she was innocent, it would have no effect. Well, many times as a leader, you have to drink the bitter water, whether you're innocent or not. And in many cases, I found in the real estate world that I would get accused of, or people would be angry about this or that, because you have to make decisions that affect people's pocketbooks, and they thought you made the wrong decision. And many times you knew very well you had made the right decision, but you had to take, or even all sorts of scenarios I could create, which we don't need to get into. But the point is, you have to be willing to take ownership for those things that you really shouldn't have to, and say, and just let it fall away.
Yes.
And it can be difficult because you want to. The natural reaction of a leader in those cases is to want to justify, explain why you're right, they're wrong, and all those sorts of things. And sometimes you just have to just bear the burden of that.
Yeah, I've often heard it said that we want to be understood, but we just need to be understanding, or more Christ-like.
I had a real interesting encounter with an individual. Actually, this is now in the ministry realm, but I had a meeting set up with an individual that I felt like I really needed to confront them about something. And in retrospect, I did need to confront them, and it was the right thing to do. My approach was wrong. I went into that meeting with an agenda. What I should have done is went into that meeting seeking first to understand before I saw it to be understood, which actually is a principle I learned in business. But in that meeting, I saw where I had gone wrong was the confronting that I had to do needed to happen. But I didn't first ask questions, seek to understand where they were coming from. I just went in and said, here's what I see, and here's what I think should happen.
Yeah, it's often that what we say, that's important. It is important, but how we say
Certainly.
it. So that's really what's happening. Any other principles in those days before we fast forward
Larry, there's probably so many. I hardly even know where to go with them all. But none are coming to mind right now.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Now, talk about how long were you in business, and how did you get involved in the church world leadership? And I've often, Deryl, told people that I think people in business make great church leaders, great pastors, senior pastors, because they've learned these principles in the real world, so to speak.
Right.
I don't think it's a prerequisite for everyone, but I think it's helpful. So talk to me about that process. How long were you involved in business? How did you get involved in church leadership?
Yeah. So I agree with what you said. Being in business isn't a prerequisite, but I've often said, like, if a guy gets out of school, goes to seminary, and jumps right into being a pastor, he should have to be in business 5 or 10 years first.
That would help.
And it would really be helpful to experience that real world stuff that people have to deal with. But in any event, back to your question, how did that all happen for me? So we had children when I was in my 20s, and so I had 3 small children. I was starting a real estate company. I got involved in developing, a little bit into building. I was on the board of directors of the Lancaster County Association of Realtors, ultimately became the president of the Lancaster County Association of Realtors, and I was just full bore real estate.
Yeah.
And during some of those years, while I wouldn't have recognized it at the time, my spiritual growth was rather stunted because I was just so focused on business. And then one time we had a guest speaker from the country of New Zealand come and speak at our church at Westgate. And he had at the end of his message an invitation. And it was one of those sorts of invitations that I thought everybody would respond to. Kind of like, I don't remember what it was. You want more of Jesus, would you say it? Something like that, So I stood up expecting the whole congregation to stand up. But I was genuine. I wanted to respond to whatever it was. And only about 7 of us stood up. And that didn't intimidate me. I was fine with that. But what I didn't realize is that he was going to prophesy over each one of us. And I don't think he realized it when he did the invitation either. Right. But not only did he prophesy over each one of us, the 7 of us that were standing, he started with me with no warning. He just said, he looked at me and he said, "Brother," he said, "you need to be less focused on business. You need to be more." He just read my mail. More focused on the Lord and whatever all he said. It was just so right on, and I'm just standing there, kind of like shaking in my boots, like, "Thus saith the Lord," And so it was very impacting to me, and I sort of started to rearrange my priorities a bit at that point in life. And so one of the things that I did, strangely enough, that was really transformative in my life is I began attending our church's Tuesday morning men's breakfast. And so in that breakfast, we would have, like, usually a speaker would share some kind of topic, and then we'd have about 45 minutes of discussion. And it was just one of those things of iron sharpening iron. And so it was a time when a real spiritual growth. My wife would say to me, when you began attending that men's breakfast is when I noticed the biggest change in your life.
Interesting.
It was amazing. And so from that then, as I began to get involved in that and become more focused probably on spiritual things and on the spiritual growth, I was ultimately asked to serve on the elders team at our church. Interesting story about that is that one Tuesday morning at men's breakfast, one of the men came to me who I had sold a house to, and he said, "My wife and I are thinking of selling our house." And he asked me to come out and do a market analysis on their house. And I said, "Well, why are you selling your house?" He said, "Well, didn't you hear?" And he mentioned one of the elders from our church is moving out of the area. And I had no idea. I hadn't heard about it. Apparently I was the last one to hear, but most people knew about it. But this elder was going to be moving out of state. And so he was selling his house, and they were thinking about buying that house. And I said, wow, I was amazed. I didn't know this elder was moving out of the area. So later that morning, I was in my real estate office. My secretary buzzed me and said, Dwayne Britton is on the phone for you. Well, Dwayne Britton was our senior pastor at the time.
Right.
And before I picked up the phone, I just felt like the Holy Spirit said, he's going to ask you to be an elder in the church. And you're supposed to do it. Really? I mean, it was just that sudden, just that instant. So I picked up the phone, and Dwayne said, we want to get together with you and Mim and have a meeting. So we worked that out. And I called Mim and said, Dwayne and Raina want to get together with us, and I know what they want. They're going to ask us to be elders. She said, They are not. So now, Mim and I had never talked about being elders in the church. It never had entered my mind once. We never thought about it. It wasn't something I aspired to. It was not even on my radar. But instantly, I knew that's what they wanted, and I really felt confirmation. And so we got together with them for lunch, and yes, they did ask us to be elders in the church, and that's exactly what it was. And so I said, of course, we'll pray about it, but I did pray about it, but I didn't really have to because I already knew that God
Sure.
said this was what you're supposed to do. So we did. We got on the elders team, and as time went on, probably got more and more engaged in the whole church life and church governance and all that sort of thing. And we were having an elders retreat one day, and elders and pastors retreat.
Right.
And up at Kenbrook Bible Camp, I can still remember where I was sitting. I know the exact spot I was sitting in that room and what seat I was sitting in. And our senior pastor, Dwayne Britton, said, I feel like I probably have 3 to 5 years left to serve in this role.
Right.
And I'm going to be, probably stepping down at that point. And again, in an instant, I just heard the Holy Spirit say, and I've called you to be the next senior
Really?
pastor of the church. Hey, I wasn't a pastor. I hadn't had any formal ministry training. I was a real estate agent,
Right.
a business owner who also served as an elder. And through a long series of events, I ended up coming on the pastoral staff and ultimately then became the senior pastor.
Yeah, talk to those of us who are enjoying our discussion right now who are in business.
Mm-hmm.
They're not elders. They're, not pastors. Don't even feel called to that at this point in their lives. Could be in the future.
Sure.
But as you look back in your life in the business world, and I know you still do some of both. I get that. But you said you were so focused on that, you felt like maybe you missed some things. What would you do different? What would you tell them? This is what I would do different.
Well, one of the things that as soon as I got into full-time ministry, full-time vocational, everybody's in full-time ministry. But
Exactly.
Full-time vocational
Say
ministry,
that again.
Everybody's in
Yes,
ministry.
that's true.
Full-time vocational ministry, I immediately recognized the tremendous opportunity that I had in the business realm to influence, to interact with people who were non-believers that I had wasted for years.
Right. That's good.
So disappointed when I thought about all the opportunities that I wasted. And so immediately, within a month or two, I went back to the real estate office and I said to all these people I had all these relationships with, I said, let's start before sales meeting. We had a sales meeting one day a week, and I said, before sales meeting, I want to start a discussion group. Didn't call it a Bible study. We're going to do just a discussion group, talk about life issues. And of course, I had all these relationships. And so people were like, well, yeah, that'd be great. And so I started out with like about 12 or 14 people in this discussion group. And so I started out with the question, do you believe there's a God? And so that was the first question. So we all talked about that. And then we took Rick Warren's 40-day, what's that called? Purpose-driven life, that's what it's called.
Sure.
And so we walked through that one chapter a week for 40 weeks. And we got into all these discussions. And so point I'm making is I saw all the missed opportunities I had, and then I went back and tried to leverage those relationships and was able to. So for several years I did that, and it worked out really, really well. But my point is, in the business realm, business people are influencers.
Yes.
They have tremendous influence. You've got customers, you've got employees, you've got vendors, you've got bankers, you've got accountants,
That's right.
and on it goes. And you've got all these people you have contact with. And when I got into full-time ministry, I was scrambling. I was desperate to find somebody who wasn't just another church person. I wanted to interact with the world. And so use these opportunities, because you don't realize many times these great opportunities, and just ask the right questions. Just ask some leading questions. Get involved in discussions that go beyond the finance you're dealing with or the business transaction you're dealing with.
Yeah. Now, I have business friends who tell me that everything you're saying, yes and amen. They say also that somehow they've learned that they can really trust God to give them wisdom and discernment in their business, and
Sure.
you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, certainly. God's very interested in their business and having them succeed in their business and run it well. And so I know one of the things that I also would do is I would, if I had to do things over in business, I would spend more time in prayer over my business, hearing God on very just nuts and bolts business decisions. A lot of times in those years in business, I simply relied on my own intuition, my own logic, my own intelligence. And I would run that business differently if it were today. I would look more for Holy Spirit guidance, Holy Spirit, just moments of direction that as He spoke to me.
God is the best real estate agent in the world.
Yeah, He is. Best business
He lives
owner.
it now as the best business owner.
Yeah.
Now let's continue on with your story, because we want to talk about in a moment how what you learned in the business world helped you in the church world. But let's continue on. Okay, so here you were, associate pastor of the church, and then you went through the process to become a senior pastor. Talk about that.
Yeah. So I came on as we called it an executive pastor at the time. It was a little more geared towards running the nuts and bolts, the business aspects of the church, but also many ministry things as well. But so my role as I came on, I saw it as I need to do whatever I can to make our senior pastor look good.
That's good.
That was my role.
That's so good.
Yeah, and I was not there to promote my own agenda.
Right.
I was not there to become the next senior pastor, even though I felt I was called to that.
Right.
I could not promote that agenda. I was not there to promote myself. I was there to promote the leader I was serving.
And you
under.
did that very well. Yeah.
Well, I felt like we developed a tremendous relationship. We really did, because he trusted me. We developed a tremendous trust relationship. He knew that I had his back. He knew that I was there to serve him. And honestly, from my perspective, what I've seen in ministry over the years, I don't want to say this wrong because it could sound like I'm trying to toot my own horn, but I don't see enough of that.
Right.
I don't see enough of that where people are there to serve the person that they're under and to really help that person succeed and look good.
Right.
And ultimately, what sometimes what people forget is ultimately, as I guess to use an old axiom, that a rising tide raises all ships.
Yeah, exactly.
And so as you promote another person's agenda, their cause, make them look good, make the organization look good, it's going to elevate you as well. And so this call I had to senior pastor, I felt like I needed to hold it with very open hands, very loosely, because if God wanted it to happen, it was going to happen. If he didn't want it to happen, I didn't want it to happen.
Right.
So I really held it with loose, open hands. And I remember the process after our senior pastor did announce that he was stepping down. It was a year-long process of our elders team looking for the new senior leader, and it was a very difficult year because I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt I was called to be that person. But some other people felt like they were too.
Right.
And so, and I was not going to campaign for that job. I was not going to try to get involved in the process. And I would have people come to me and say things like, why don't they see? Obviously you're the guy. And I would just have to say, well, I'm sure God will direct them well.
Exactly, yeah. I remember that well because obviously I was involved in that process and saw the hand of God on you, knew that you're the one also called to give leadership. But that's a key to leadership because you cannot just autocratically appoint someone to leadership. You need to get buy-in from the people around you. And of course, you've seen the blessing of God in your leadership team and your pastoral team, and unity and working together has been amazing. But you didn't jump out of the process. Yeah. So, real key is the process.
That process was extremely important. I actually don't think it was as much for me, though it worked something in me as well. But it really, I think, it was more for our eldership team and our leadership team, because they got to the place where they were completely unified on this decision, and anything short of that process could have short-circuited what really needed to happen for God to put everything into place. So it ended up not being a fun process for Mem and I, but a good process for the church.
Now today you're leading a growing church, a great group of eldership, great group of pastors. I mean, healthy, amazing what God's doing. And what could you say today that you picked up from business and your time in business that's helping you today, being a spiritual leader, leading these people? And obviously, you're training people around the world. I mean, you're in South America and different parts of the world. You and I were in Africa teaching leadership together a couple of years ago. I mean, that's who you are. You're a leader of leaders. But talk about just a few things you would have learned in the past that would help you today.
Yeah. So we were talking about the fact that sometimes you have to drink the bitter cup of water.
Yes.
Okay. There is another aspect of that I'd like to talk about, and that is when you receive unfair, unjust criticism, which if you're a leader, you will. You better be ready for it.
Par for the course.
It's going to happen. So you need to look for the 5% of truth in that ridiculous criticism you're receiving, because there's usually something there. I remember one time I was very, very falsely accused in one of the most difficult ways ever. It was a very difficult experience because I knew what they were saying was completely false. I knew we don't need to get into that. But the point is, when that person was criticizing me, I was able to take a step back and say, you know what? they have a point on this
Yeah.
one little thing.
Even 1%.
Yeah, even one. Yeah, not 5%, 1%.
Right.
You know, even if it's 1%, what we tend to do when we're criticized is we justify, and even if we don't verbalize it. You know, in fact, just the other day, I had something that was a bit of a criticism. It wasn't nasty, but it was a little bit of a criticism, and I don't actually agree with some of the input I received. And I found myself doing what we can't do, and that it was in your own mind, you run through it again and again and again, and you justify why you're right and why that criticism was wrong, and you just got to stop that.
Exactly.
Don't rehash all that. Say, okay, I've looked at it, I feel comfortable with where I'm at, but they do have a point on this 1% or 2% or 10%, whatever it is. I do need to deal with that. And almost always inside of criticism, there's 1 to 10% that we need to adjust. I mean, it may be 99%, but even if it's real false criticism, there's something that we can learn from that.
Right. Now you're leading a healthy team of pastors and leaders, and and multiple staff. And talk about principles you've learned about how do you lead a team.
Yeah, so how do you lead a team?
How do you lead a healthy team and keep people healthy?
I believe that for me, one of the first prerequisites to a healthy team is communication.
Yes.
Communication. And I'm amazed many times how difficult people find it to communicate. Yeah. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
I mean, like just even on electronic communication, returning emails, returning texts, returning phone calls. When I was in the business world, Larry, if I wouldn't have returned phone calls quickly, I'd have got run out of the business on a rail. I mean, people, they expected you were going to return phone calls, and everybody in the business knew the people that did. If you get in a business setting and we talk, somebody's name come up, oh yeah, they never return phone calls, and you just wave them off as not important. Yeah. What I found in ministry realm that I was disappointed in, I found pastors that you can leave a message and they might return your call next week if they feel like it. Yeah. That is not acceptable. No, it's not. It's just not acceptable. No. And we should be better than the business world. That's right, I agree. We should be setting the standard for the business world. I agree. So I am... Yeah, you're talking about one of my pet peeves. It really is. It's like, what is wrong? Why can't you get back on an email? It's going to take you 3 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever. Yeah. Exactly. But, I find those in the business world who've been in the business world do that a lot better because they've learned it in that setting. They do it a lot better in the church world. Right. And so I don't understand that either, but that's an important leadership principle. It's so important. Yeah. It's so important. And the other thing that I found in the church world that kind of disappointed me was a pursuit of, desire of excellence. And so some people confuse perfectionism with excellence. They're two different things. They are. We're not talking about perfectionism here. Perfectionism is a taskmaster. And we're not talking about putting that on ourselves. Right. But we're talking about pursuing excellence. Yeah. And many times in the church world, people think, well, it's the church, and and everything is like, it doesn't have to be to the same level of excellence and pursuit of excellence that people pursue in the business world. That too shouldn't be the case. We should be pursuing an excellence in everything we do. The appearance of the building, our presentations with audio visual stuff, and everything you can think of. It should be pursuing excellence, and I feel like that is a place that the church world could grow in. Yeah. Okay. And of course, that you also learned in the business world, and that comes over into the church world. So, what about, you did talk about communication? Let's talk about different kinds of communication. Obviously, you're preaching. There's one kind of communication. There's getting back on emails, another kind of communication. Talk a bit more about that. What are some areas of communication or things that a younger leader should learn and think about now in their communication process that'll help them for the future? So the whole public speaking thing is a huge thing. It really is. And so if you're going to be a leader, not just a senior pastor, just a leader, a church leader, you're going to be in front of people talking. Right. And that how you communicate is so terribly, terribly important. I studied public speaking at length. I would watch other speakers. I would emulate what they did. I'd see somebody speaking and say, that works the way they did that, and I would try it. And the other thing that I did is that I would watch my sermons. And good for you. Now, let me just tell you, that is a disheartening thing to do. It is. I know. I've been there, done that. And that's really, really good. Oh, man, you learn so much. I can't believe I say that word that way, or slur that word, or my Pennsylvania Dutch comes out with that word, or just or I didn't engage the audience well with my eyes, or whatever it is, and you learn things watching yourself that, like I said, is disheartening sometimes, but you grow.
Right.
And so I would really encourage people to study public speaking, learn how to engage the audience, because we're not putting on a show, but if you don't engage well, your message isn't going to get across. You may preach the best message ever with the best principles, but if you're not engaging people, they walk in the door and don't remember a thing you said. Exactly. So we really need to be careful to engage people, use personal examples from your life.
Yes.
Such a big deal.
It is.
When I had people come up to me today from a message I preached 8 or 10 years ago, and they'll talk about that story that I shared. They remember the story, and so it drives home points by remembering those stories. So it's such a big deal to be able to share personal stories as you share. And for me personally, was one thing that I started years ago that I assumed I would quit doing after I became more proficient, was practicing my messages. Now I know not many people do this, and that's fine if you can do well without doing it. I practice my messages. So what I do is I will preach the message from the pulpit to an empty audience, empty chairs, usually at least twice before I deliver the message. Two things happen about that. Number one, the Bible says that faith comes by hearing, and hearing the Word of God. I'm preaching to myself. Many times when I get done with that practice session, I think, I'm pumped up. That was good. Man, I can't wait to deliver that message. That was so good. The other thing that can happen is the reverse. I'll preach it, I'm like, oh man, that was work. That didn't go well. And then I go back and tweak it and change it. But by the time I preach it to the third time, maybe to a live audience, I have it mostly memorized, and it's not like I'm stumbling my way through something. I've already spoke this. I'm excited about it. I'm passionate about it, and wow, it really works well for me. Many leaders may not need that, but it works for me.
I often have not done that, but I have many friends who've done that, who said they've preached to an empty auditorium 2 or 3 times, and just to make sure that this is really what they believe God's saying, it's worked for them. And back to your stories, I just agree with you wholeheartedly. I remember years ago when I was just really young, I started to teach Bible studies. I thought, how can I teach with life, and how can I teach where people respond? And so I picked up this book by D.L. Moody, the evangelist of late 1800s, and I read this thing, all his sermons, and they were all stories. It was story after story after story, and I realized people remember the story, and then they remember the truth. So I affirm what you're saying. Now, there's lots of ways to communicate, of course, public speaking. Have you learned, what about communicating with staff, communicating, your heart with elders? What have you learned about that? How do you do that?
One of the things that I am, I don't want to get into personality profiles too much and all that, but I've studied many of those. And by the way, if you're a leader, you need to understand those.
You do.
It's
you really do.
Deal. The DISC.
You serve people by doing that.
Oh, man, it's such a big deal. DISC, Myers-Briggs, Taylor-Johnson temperamental analysis, the Berkman is one that I've used a good bit. These things are important to really understand other people and to understand ourselves. So to use the Berkman for an example, it's an organization out of Houston, has a really good system. I am an expediter. It means I like to get things done. I want to make things happen. Then there's people who are planners. And then there's people who are administrators. And so I can do administration. That doesn't bother me, But I prefer to make things happen and get things done. What I really don't like is the planning. So let's sit down and I mean, I'm a visionary person, but I don't want to sit down and take 3 days on a planning retreat. After a while, my hair just starts to hurt. We got to stop this planning. We got to make something happen. And so that's what I've learned, is that's my weak area. And many people really thrive on that. They want to know what the plan is, and even not just know what the plan is, they want to process the plan with you, and it's really important. So I don't like that stuff. And so, like when doing an elders retreat, I really have to get resourced by other people on how I'm going to do that. Because and by the way, that's one of the things I've appreciated about having connections with here at Dove International. I got lots of good ideas from you, lots of good ideas from Ron Meyer, Steve Prokopchek. I get resources, and here's an exercise we're going to walk through together. If I have to dream this stuff up, it's going to fail. I'm just not. So it's important to know what we're good at and what we're not good at.
Excellent. You're resourcing your weaknesses.
That's what you do.
Do you use people on your team then who are strong in those areas and say, why don't you lead this part of it? Do you do that?
I have in our staff staff meetings. In fact, just later today in our staff meeting, one of the associate pastors is going to lead that meeting in a certain thing we want to do because it's what he does well. So yeah, we definitely do that.
That's excellent leadership. Yeah. Now, we've said different people receive communication differently, and let's talk a bit about, you get an idea, and you get this idea from God. You've been in the mountains or whatever, and God spoke to you, and you're ready to see this thing happen. How do you process that with your team? Yeah. What does that look as? A lot of leaders fail at this.
Yeah.
They're hearing from God clearly, but they're missing the process. How do you do that?
Yeah. So I'll talk about it as it relates to elders team. It would apply to pastoral team as well. But so if I there was a certain issue that came to me that I really felt like we needed to go a certain direction with the church. I'm not going to get into the details; it would take too long. But so what I'll do is I'll take that thought and I'll just ask the team, "What do you think about this? What are your ideas? Let's discuss this." And particularly on the elders team, I pretty much try, unless it's just like a slam dunk, I try not to make the decision in one meeting.
Right.
So I say, okay, we've heard everybody's input on that. Let's go back. Let's pray about this. Let's process this. We'll talk about it next meeting. Yeah. That may go on, depending on what the issue is, and that may go on 4 or 5 meetings.
Yes.
Okay. As an expediter, that can be difficult.
That hurts.
I want to go. I want to move.
Yeah.
But experience has taught me that process time is so very, very important.
Yes.
And so I'm now okay with that. It actually doesn't hurt as bad as it used to, because I realize it's okay, we'll get there. And typically, if I've really felt like I've heard God on something and this is where we need to go, the team's going to be there.
They will.
We just got to give them the time to get there.
Yeah.
So I heard a wise leader once told me that when you're leading a church, it's not, and you're trying to steer in a certain direction. It's not like turning a rowboat that you have a little tiller back there and you just turn on. It's like an ocean liner.
That's right.
And you just got to. You might take 2 miles to turn that thing a little bit of a different direction, where the rowboat can turn in 10 feet. And so you need to think about that analogy. This is an ocean liner we're turning.
Right.
And we're going to turn it very slowly and very gently, and we're not going to rock anybody's world. We just got to take it. We got to take our time.
And you know that's such a good analogy. And the thing we have to understand about that is the larger the ministry, the larger the church, the more of an ocean liner, and often the longer it takes. So, you know, I sometimes I'm with younger leaders and they'll say, "Why don't you just make a decision?" Well, they're leading a group of 20 people or 50 people or 100 people, whatever, and you can move fairly fast then. It's only a few people, or they slide off the boat and are gone, you know. But it just takes time because people need ownership.
Sure.
And people need to feel valued in the process. And that's exactly what you're doing. You're valuing them in the process. Yeah. Great. This has been awesome. Any other insights you want to share today with us in our discussion on leadership? If you were right now 20 years of age saying, "I know I'm called to leadership," I think it might be business. If you were back in those days, or it could be church, of course, the same basic principles. Is there anything else you'd like to offer to those who are in our discussion today?
Yeah, I would. Just engage in the process God's taking you through. So when I was young, I thought everything had to happen by tomorrow afternoon. You know, it had to happen now. And of course, we can use the analogy of Joseph. He heard God. He had dreams. Yeah. His dreams were correct.
They were.
But it was going to take a lot of years and some hard knocks to get there. And so, if you have a dream from God that you really feel He's called you to, don't think that has to happen tomorrow afternoon. I use the example of you holding things loosely. I think when the harder you grip things, the more they slip out of your hands many times. So we hold it loosely, but keep the vision in front of you. Like, don't let the vision die. So keep whatever you need to do. Like if you have a prophetic word, transcribe it. Write it down, read it from time to time. There's something like that to keep that vision alive, keep that dream alive. But don't think you need to make it happen. As soon as you try to go out and force whatever that dream, that vision is to happen, you may short circuit the process. Now, it's a delicate balance because you also can't be lethargic, lazy.
Exactly.
And, so if God opens doors, you need to walk through them.
That's right.
But don't try to kick the doors open.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you this, Shep, because you live in these two worlds. You're still doing some business on the side, right?
You
still sell
a little bit. I like to keep my finger in that world a little bit because it's
if I want to
fun.
buy a house, you'd still help me get a house, right?
If you beg, I might.
Well, here's the deal. you're still living these two worlds.
Yeah.
And I meet some leaders, especially in other nations, but even in this nation, they feel like when you're called to be a pastor, you're called to be in leadership, it'd be wrong to be messing in the business world,
Right.
you know. And because it's almost like the sacred and secular, which is
Sure.
crazy. It's not true. Like
Right.
you said, it's all ministry.
Right.
If you're ministry in your business, ministry in a job, ministry in the church, it's all ministry.
Absolutely.
Just who pays the bills. And God's the source for all of us.
Right.
Now, how does that work for you? Are you able to balance that? Or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so I can, like what happened my first 5 years in ministry, I still did a fair amount of real estate on the side, and it worked out really well. It didn't interfere with my business world. And because I had been in the business so long, I had all these contacts, and people would call me up, want to do business, and so it didn't require an exorbitant amount of time. But then after 5 years, when I became the senior pastor, I made a conscious decision to lay this down. So I pretty much, anytime anybody would contact me, say, let me refer you to a friend of mine. I'm unable to do that right now. But then after doing that for about 4 or 5 years, I felt like I had my feet on the ground well enough as a senior pastor. And I began to see the influence and the connections and the opportunities that I was missing. So I decided, I made a conscious decision to engage a little bit more back into that world, just to keep those contacts alive and to keep my finger in that world as well, because I see it as you described. I see it as very, very important in connecting church and ministry with the business world. I do not see that in problematic at all. In fact, I think there should be more connection made. It's very healthy. So, and having made a conscious decision to do that, I now do a little bit more, still not much because I'm very, very busy, but I do have to be careful because I have this, I'm an expediter. I want to make things happen. So anything that comes my way, I want to, I'll do that. I can do that. And so I do have to consciously be careful to guard my time, and I have to listen to my wife.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I want to ask you that question yet. You are in a unique setting. You, obviously senior pastor of Westgate Church. Mim, your wife, is one of the associate pastors of the church. How does that work?
Well, it works very, very well, because back in the days when I was in real estate, I always had this idea that I could have my wife come on maybe as an assistant or help me in that role. She was a homemaker. She wasn't working outside the home. We had 3 little children, and she was, doing. She was busy, and so that was never going to work. That's not who she was. In fact, it got to the point where we really didn't talk about business at all at home, and it wasn't an unhealthy thing. We had other things to talk about. She just didn't connect with the business world at all. Now in ministry, we connect extremely well. So we probably, if anything, we have to be careful that we don't just talk about church all the time. We have other things that, so we don't become too, everything's about the church and ministry. But working alongside of her in this role has worked out very, very well. I would say it's connected us in our marriage at a deeper level than we've ever been connected with before.
It's also so healthy to have women in leadership with us, because half of the church is women. And they need a connection that God, could use them in the same way God is using men, and seeing those kind of models are really important. I think you've done that really well. I
do want to say one more thing about that, about listening to our spouses. I remember still in the business realm, I made a decision to make a financial move in business. And very, very seldom did Mim give me any input on that kind of thing, because she just didn't connect with it. And so I said, here's what I'm planning on doing. She said, I don't know that that's such a good idea. You might want to rethink that. And my mind was, she doesn't understand this stuff. I know, I got this. And I went ahead with that decision, and it cost me a lot of money. And so it would have been very wise for me to heed her counsel in that situation. So if your spouse has a check about something, you better back up and just take a time out. Maybe you go forward with it after you're on the same page, but don't move forward if you're not in unity on that.
That is so important. I've learned that the hard way too. I get that too, and I agree. In closing, anything you'd like to say to any younger leaders, people aspiring leadership? You'd like to speak to them, say, here's something that would really help you. Is there anything else in your heart you want to say?
I would. I feel like there's so many opportunities to get trained, to be developed in who you are. Like when I was in real estate, I took all kinds of sales training courses, finance courses, you name it, all kinds of stuff. I was always taking some kind of class and course. I learned so much that way and grew so much. And the same is true whether it be, and by the way, if you think you're called to ministry, take sales courses.
Sure.
Take whatever.
Sure.
Grow, develop yourself
Yes.
as a person holistically. It's not, if it's not a spiritual thing, I should. No. Learn to grow. Take public speaking classes,
Yes.
take sales classes,
Yes.
take whatever, things like that come along, and do the Dove Hopewell Leadership Training School. I mean, that school is phenomenal.
Yeah.
And so those sorts of opportunities, if you feel like you're called to leadership, whether it be business or ministry, just look for those opportunities, press into them. You're going to grow so much and learn so much, and you'll be real happy that you did that.
But thanks for joining me today. This is really, really good.
Yeah.
And so we're so glad you've joined us today. And together we're finding ways that we can find these leadership truths, even these small things that might seem very small, but that which will cause huge events or huge results in the future as we continue to obey the Lord, whether it's in the business world or whether it's in the church world or both, and wherever God's called. So Deryl, thank you again for joining us.
You bet. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Larry Kreider's Leadership Podcast. If you want more information about any of Larry's books, daily devotionals, small group resources, or any other teachings, go to larrykreider.com.